Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Auf, mein Herz und du, mein ganzer Sinn, which translates to, now wake my heart, all my soul within. This is a fairly straightforward chorale with some interesting key modulations throughout. I think the introduction is a little bit interesting as well. If we could even call it an introduction, I suppose the first phrase might be a better way to call it. But we have some interesting key choices and modulation choices throughout. But other than that, it's a relatively straightforward chorale. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So we have one sharp in the key signature. We start on G major. We end on G major. I think the overall tonality of the chorale is G major, but I do think we start in the key of E minor, and I had a bit of an epiphany here. For some reason, when I heard the introduction of the chorale and I heard two G major chords, one after the other, my first thought was, we're in the key of G major, and then we pivot very quickly to the key of E minor by the time we cadence. I mean, after all, the first phrase is only 4 beats long, but something that dawned on me is the fact that why don't I think that a chorale that's in a major key, say for example G major, starting on E minor, how come I could hear that in the key of G major, but I can't hear a chorale that starts in the key of E minor with a G major chord? I feel like it should go both ways, or maybe just the nature of major chords versus minor chords means that major chords tend to have a stronger tonic inducing effect. I don't know, but I decided in a display of trying to show more equity between major and minor keys, instead of saying that we have this very abrupt modulation to the key of E minor, which I think would be a valid analysis as well, we're just going to analyze the whole phrase in the key of E minor. So our first chord is not a 1 chord, but rather a 3 chord with the neighboring 7th in the bass. We then have G major again, no need to reanalyze, G, D, G, and B. And then we have E's here. This E is a non-chord tone, this E is a non-chord tone, and I think very briefly this turns into a 1-6 chord before we immediately get 5 afterwards, D sharp, F sharp, B, and B, which is B major over D sharp, 5-6. We also have a passing 7th in the alto before our imperfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor, where we cadence on our tonic, E, E, G, and B. We're going to see this motive in a melody later, where we continue an entire phrase where the melody sings the same pitch, and it ends with an imperfect authentic cadence with the 5th of the chord in the melody. We'll see that later on. Moving ahead, we have a phrase that is interesting. We have a mid-phrase modulation where we end the phrase in a different key than what we started in. I'm convinced that this phrase here in the beginning is A minor. We get A melodic minor throughout with the F sharp, the G sharp, and the A, but we end on G major, which is really interesting. So why Bach even felt compelled to go to A minor here as opposed to just writing the whole phrase in G major, that's entirely up to him, but it's always interesting when we get a mid-phrase modulation like that. So we start off with C, E, A, and E. That's an A minor chord in first inversion, which is 4-6 in the key of E minor, and it is also our tonic triad in the key of A minor as well. We then have C, A, F sharp, and D, and where this sort of looks like we might be moving to the key of G major, this is actually harmonization of the melodic minor scale, more specifically the A melodic minor scale, and this D7 over C chord is 5-4-2. This G is a neighbor tone, this E is a neighbor tone, and then we get the same chord again on the next beat, so we don't need to reanalyze. But if we take a look at the passing tones in 3 of the voices here, B, B, G sharp, and also take into account the D here in the melody, we have G sharp diminished over B, which is a 7-6 chord. 4 going to 7 is a good sign, it's a normative progression. 4-4-2 going to 7-6 is an even better sign, because 4-2 chords typically resolve down by step in the bass, because that's where the 7th of the chord is, and we would expect that to go to A minor, which it does. A, C, A, and C. 2 roots, 2 thirds. It's always interesting when Bach spells chords that way. We have a passing tone in the tenor, a neighbor tone in the bass, and then we get another A minor chord. But this A minor chord is particularly interesting because we have A, E, and C, which is, another tonic triad. But I think this F sharp here going to the G natural, it's what's more interesting here. And we see Bach do this from time to time where one voice has the potential to completely change the function and the quality and the context of the chord. So I do think that Bach is using A minor as a pivot to go to the key of G major, but I think the A minor chord is actually it actually has like a split personality here where it has two characteristics. I think this 2 chord is also being recontextualized as 7/6 in the key of G major. Of course, 2 is a perfectly valid analysis. We could even say that there is a 2 going to 7 chord here, but if you've watched any of my videos in the past that have encountered a situation like this, we know that the difference between a 2 chord and a 7 chord is just a whole step. It's E versus F sharp in this case in the key of G major. So I think, all in all, when Bach flips the script here and then changes the quality of the chord over the span of the beat, yes, A minor was the original subject of, the original common chord between the 2 keys, but I think it's the 7/6 chord here that actually is what's pertinent to us. And granted, we do have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because Bach, in a very similar fashion to what this sounds like, where it sounds almost like he's modulating to the key of E minor right before the cadence, he's modulating to the key of G major right before the cadence as well. So A minor here, introducing this F sharp and going to G natural rather than G sharp like we saw earlier, I think changes the quality of the A minor chord. And in my notes, I've been calling this tonicization of 7 because ultimately speaking, we're preceding the chord with a stable chord. And sometimes he actually goes to the trouble of preceding the A minor chord with its dominant, which in this case he is. We're just getting it a 1 chord later, right? We have this G sharp diminished chord here, which would be tonicizing A minor. But this F sharp, I think, ultimately supersedes or overrides the role of this E here. Notice how E only occurs once in this chord, and then the F sharp kind of replaces it and changes its function. So we see 2 turning into 7/6 here. Right before the cadence, it's about as abrupt and as it's about as short a notice as possible where we could get some type of modulation. And at the beginning of the video when I was talking about his modulation choices, I was really talking about this phrase right here. But yes, we ultimately cadence on G major, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad. And this is just another interesting case of Bach turning a 2 chord into a 7/6 chord over 1 beat. And just to clarify why this is important, or why I think this is an interesting thing that Bach does, I think one voice, if only one voice is moving, I don't really feel like there's a chord progression going on. If the rest of the voices are static and one voice moves, it doesn't really feel like a chord is happening. It just feels more like counterpoint, and it just so happens that the chord that's happening at that moment, local to that beat, is changing. And then the power of one voice is interesting in that way. But regardless, we're going to move to the next phrase. This next phrase is in the key of G major. We end in a perfect authentic cadence, no modulations in this phrase. So we have another G major chord here, G, B, D, and G. No need to reanalyze. We then have F sharp, A, D, and A, which is D major over F sharp. That's 5/6. This E is a passing tone. This E is a passing tone. And then we have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is just taking our D major chord and putting it in root position. We have a passing 7th in the tenor and a passing tone in the alto before we get G, B, D, and B, which is our tonic triad, G major in root position. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor before we get E, G, G, and C. This is C major over E, which is a 4/6 chord. This E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have D, A, F sharp, and D. That's another 5 chord, D major. This F sharp is a chord tone. This A is a chord tone. The C is a passing 7th. And then we have E, G, G, and B, which is an E minor triad. That's a 6 chord. We also have a passing 7th in the bass. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it as well. We then have C, E, G, and A. That's A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. This A is a chord tone, this A is a chord tone, this F sharp is a non-chord tone. You might be wondering, Forrest, why in this case when we have a 2 chord and then there's an F sharp here that we don't analyze it like a 7 chord rather than in this case where we turn it into a 7 chord. And the best answer I can give you is context. We know here that in a cadential situation, 7, typically speaking, would be functioning like a dominant chord. Like in this case, the dominant chord would be the last chord we see before our tonic. In this case, the 2-6-5 chord, as we know from other cadential situations we've seen in Bach, we know that it's going to be the chord that precedes a dominant functioning chord, more specifically and pretty much always a 5 chord. And when you can tell the difference between those two situations, between where we're using 2 versus where we're using 7, also, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Yeah, when you could tell the difference between 2 and 7, there are other contextual factors as well. This F sharp is so brief. It looks kind of like there's a suspension going on here, but the note above the suspension is a consonant, so I feel like it's more of like a rhythmic convention rather than it trying to achieve some type of cheeky dissonance like other suspensions are trying to achieve. But all in all, very certain that this is a 2 chord where it's functioning as a predominant chord. We would expect a 5 afterwards. Even though the F sharp is present, it's not functioning like a dominant chord in this case. On the next beat, however, we do get our dominant chord, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, D major. This D is a chord tone, the C is a very brief passing 7th, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad. Looking ahead, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. And I think we spend the whole phrase in the key of D major, just like how we spend our whole time here in the key of E minor, because if we were to call this the beginning of the B section, which I'm pretty convinced it is, because the phrases have very similar proportion, symmetrical to one another. If you just imagine this like the pickup at the beginning of the piece, we could just move it down here and see the fact that there are 2 halves to a whole here. But the same way that this is entirely in the key of E minor, this is probably entirely in the key of D major as well. So we'll go ahead and call this G major chord our 4 in the key of D major, and then we move the bass up an octave, but above it we get an A major chord. So this is A7 over G, G, C sharp, E, and A, which is 5-4-2. And what we know about 4-2 chords is that they want to resolve to a triad in first inversion. That's typically speaking a 5th below, unless they're sharing a bass with what was happening above it. But typically the 7th ends up resolving down by step, and that's what happens here. We get F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, so that's good. We then have a passing tone in the bass, and then we have 2 neighbor tones, each in the inner voices. This leaves us with E, C sharp, G, and A. It's another 5 chord. This time it's in second inversion, A7 over E, so that's a 5-4-3 chord. And then we get D, D, F sharp, and A. That's our tonic triad in root position, D major. And then we get a neighbor tone. Actually, we get 3 neighbor tones in each of the lower 3 voices, C sharp, E, E, and A. That's another 5 chord, but this time it's in first inversion. So we go from 3rd to 2nd to 1st. And then we cadence on D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. That's pretty cool, where Bach keeps the lower 3 voices very active and just oscillates between the 1 chord and the 5 chord, because this A functions kind of like a pedal, because it's a common tone between 1 and 5. It's pretty neat. Looking ahead, we have a phrase. This is our first non-authentic cadence in the entire chorale. It is a half cadence in the key of E minor, and I think we pretty much modulate straight away. Not exactly, but the majority of the phrase is in the key of E minor. Unlike our second phrase here, where we modulate over like a stable chord, we get a chromatic bass line here. So we have D natural, D sharp, E. So I feel like by the time we hear this E minor, we're in the key of E minor. Of course, we could say that this D is a common chord. We could say that by the time we hear this D major, the D sharp is going to just have already been in the key of E minor. But I think in this case, just based on context, I feel like this is a modulation zone of sorts, and we can just say that the modulation happens at really any point in this beginning part of the phrase. What matters is that a key change is definitely happening. So this D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, it spells B major over D sharp. That's 5/6 of 2 because E minor is our 2 chord in the key of D major. This A is a passing 7th, and then we get E minor, E, B, F sharp, and G, but this F sharp is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. Of course, we know that Bach is implying a 2 chord though, and we end up getting the resolution on the next beat, but what ends up happening is the bass changes. That's something that Bach does a lot. The bass changes and affects the numbers that you would assign to the suspension, I guess. So this would be like a 9/6 suspension because moving the E up to G creates a 6th with the alto, or a 13th, I guess, technically, but 9/6 is I think a little bit more common. Intervals bigger than a 13th are a little bit redundant, I think. But afterwards, we're going to go ahead and call this E minor chord here, even though we get another E minor after the fact. Typically, I will say that I'll let the modulation occur as late as possible in my analysis if I see the same chord repeated twice. But here I feel like because it's being preceded by its own dominant, it feels like the modulation is happening here. So we'll call this our tonic in E minor, and after this passing tone on the bass, we'll just call it an inversion. And also E, B, E, and G here, kind of like taking our chord and putting it in root position. That's not a super common occurrence where Bach moves one of the tones and we have an entirely intact chord afterwards, so I'll leave that there as well. And then we get melodic minor, very similar to what's going on here in the second phrase of the A section. We get melodic minor, but this time it's in the bass rather than being in the alto. C sharp, A, E, and A. That's A major over C sharp, which is 4/6. This D sharp's a passing tone. This F sharp's a non-chord tone. This F sharp is also a non-chord tone. And that leaves us with D sharp diminished in root position, which would be a 7 chord. So 4 going to 7 rather than, well, actually 4 does go to 7 here, but we get 2 4 chords. So the harmonies in proportion to one another are different between the two phrases, and that makes sense because the voices are doing their own thing. But we're seeing the same harmonies in succession, which is reassuring. But after our 7 chord, we would expect the tonic triad, E, G, B, and G, and that's exactly what we get, E minor. This C right here as well is a non-chord tone. It does give us kind of 6 vibes, and I'm inclined to say that maybe there is a passing 6 chord happening here, and the reason why is because 6 wants to go to 2, which is the next chord that we get, A, C, E, and F sharp, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over A, which is a 2/6/5 chord. Again, D sharp making an appearance. It does make it kind of interesting, like, do we know if this is a 7 chord? Do we know that this is a 2 chord? And like I said, based on context, like I mentioned earlier, this is probably a 2 chord because it's functioning like a predominant, but in kind of a roundabout fashion, we end up getting another predominant through this chromatic bass line here. So Bach definitely varies the texture. This is not the same as the second section, but it does have its similarities. I'd say it's more different than similar, though. You have to look under the hood pretty closely to find the similarities. Other than that, it's pretty unique in terms of its profile. But this D sharp is in fact a neighbor tone. We then have A sharp, C sharp, E, and F sharp, which is F sharp 7 over A sharp. That's 5/6/5 of 5 because F sharp is the dominant of B, and B is our 5. This C sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get B major, B, B, D sharp. I feel like that's really what the role of the D sharp is to sort of just introduce the idea of D sharp here in the dominant. And then we have F sharp, which is our 5 chord. So I think it's also unlikely that this is a phrase where we get a modulation to B major for some reason. I think this is definitely a half cadence. But looking ahead to our next phrase, it is a longer one. Like, the end of the A section. It's the longest phrase proportionate to the rest of the section, and we pretty much stay in the key of G major for its entirety. We stay in E minor for a little bit, right, because we see this D sharp here, the same way that we saw this D sharp here as well, where it implied that we were still staying in the previous key. I think that I'm compelled to say that we're still in E minor, and then afterwards we're pretty much scot-free to stay in the key of G major until the end of the chorale, which does conclude with a perfect authentic cadence. So D sharp, B, B, and F sharp, that's a 5-6 chord, so we don't need to rewrite the Roman numeral. We could just change the figure bass to a 6. We also have a passing 7th in the tenor. We then have E, G, B, and G. That's our tonic triad and root position. E minor, passing 7th in the bass, neighbor tone in the tenor. And then we get C, G, E, and G. That's a 6 chord in the key of E minor. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this is another modulation zone. I said the modulation happened here, and that this C major chord is also our 4 chord in the key of G. But I'd say that you could analyze a modulation as early as this E minor chord and as late as this A minor chord here. But this is ultimately just what it sounds like to me. So A, C, E, and A. I do think this is a 2 chord. Kind of an interesting progression of 4 going to 2, not the most common progression in Bach, but we do see third space progressions between 2 and 4 from time to time. This G is a passing 7th, this F sharp is a non-chord tone, this G is a non-chord tone here. And I think actually something that I'm looking at now, I forgot to mention that this B is a non-chord tone, this B is a non-chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone. We kind of have a passing 1-6 chord here, and it kind of breaks up the 4 going to the 2. And I find that Bach does this sometimes, where he breaks up chords that are a third apart from one another with these passing chords. And sometimes, coincidentally, when you pair what's going on in the lower voices with the melody or the voice that stays static, you do get a fully voiced chord, like in this case where we have a G major triad, and it breaks up the 4 going to the 2 exactly, where we have 4 going to the tonic and then we have the tonic going to 2. So like I mentioned, this G is a passing tone, this F and this G, F sharp rather, and this G, those are both passing tones, and the 2 goes to F sharp, C, A, and A. And I know what you're thinking, or what, if you've watched my videos in the past, you might be thinking this might be a 2 going to a 7 chord here, but I don't think this is a 2 going to a 7, because if we take the whole picture here, we have D, F sharp, D, F sharp, A, and C. I think this might be some type of, it's probably some type of 5 chord, not a 7 chord, but really the difference between 7 and 5, not a huge difference. They have the same function, and they're mostly the same tones. So 2 going to 7 really in principle shouldn't be that big of a deal, but the reason I am particular about it isn't because I'm inflexible, it's because of all of the permutations of predominant going to dominant functioning chords. So that is some type of 2 or 4 chord going to some type of 5 or 7 chord. 2 going to 7 is objectively the weakest, and we don't see many instances, if any at all, of 2 going to 7 in Bach's chorales, I think for that reason, because the chords are a third apart and they share more notes in common than they don't. Like going from 2 to 5, for example, those chords share 1 note in common, and the majority of the voices are moving, which introduces more notes to the texture, more unique tones to the texture. Same thing with 4 going to 5. 4 and 5 don't share any tones in common, so the movement between them feels more progressional. It feels more like there's a cadence that's going to occur. 4 going to 7, same idea with 2 going to 5. They share a tone in common, but most of the notes are different. But 2 going to 7, they share 2 notes in common, and the only difference is introducing the leading tone. So it's a relatively weak progression, and that's why we don't see it with the same level of emphasis that other progressions occur, or other predominant to dominant progressions occur, like 4 going to 5 or 2 going to 5. So I feel ultimately what's being alluded to here is a 5 chord, maybe even a 5-7 chord, because if we're taking the whole beat into context, let's not neglect this C here. So I'll put this 7 in parentheses. and we'll call that C a passing tone, but I'm not going to neglect it. It's very possible that this could be a 5-7 chord. Doesn't really contribute too much to the progression, but you know, it's there if you chose to analyze it that way, or if you'd like to analyze it that way. But afterwards we would expect a resolution to the tonic, G, B, D, and B. That's exactly what we get. G major, this E is a non-chord tone, this F sharp's a non-chord tone. We get a very similar introduction of pitches like we had here, where the F sharp and the G were non-chord tones. Same thing going on here. And then we get E, B, G, and C. Kind of an interesting chord here. I called this a 4-6-5 chord. We do see them from time to time. This would be C major 7 over E. But with other chords being introduced to the texture, or other tones being introduced to the texture here, like this F sharp and this A, there are other chords that could be potentially extrapolated from the texture, but the fact that they're happening over this this A right here, which is also a non-chord tone, makes me feel like it's less likely that that's happening. And also I feel like a predominant chord like 2 or 4 is likely happening here, because what we have on the next beat, F sharp A, F sharp, and D, which is a 5 chord in first inversion, D major over F sharp. Then we have D, F sharp, A, and C going on here on this beat here, and because all the voices are moving, I feel like there's a need to write 7-5-3 there, because we have an entirely intact chord that's a result of moving all of the voices. So it's uncommon for all of the voices to be moving on the offbeat. It's common to see 2, it's very common to see 1 or 3, but here we see 4, so that makes me feel compelled to go out of the way to mark what's going on here. That's been consistent with pretty much all of my analysis so far. So moving forward, we have G, D, A, and B, and we might feel compelled to call this Atonic Triad, like what we had here where E minor was alluded to, because even though we had this 9/8 suspension here going on in the alto over the bass, here I think we have something different. We have a little bit of a deceptive turnaround going on, because by the time we get the resolution, we have E, E, G, and B. Bach doubles the E, and it feels like E becomes the object of what this 5 is resolving to. So I feel like actually instead of a tonic triad, this is a 6 chord, and this makes sense to me in the same way, because in the same way that the end of the A section occurred, where we had a 6 chord go to 2-6-5, and that's exactly what's happening here, which makes me feel like this is just more of an embellished version of what's going on here in the A section. So C, E, G, and A, right? That's our 2-6-5 chord, A minor 7 over C. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. And then we take our cadence out the way that we would expect, right? D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, D major. This D is a chord tone, this C is a non-chord tone, right? We're seeing a very similar cadential layout here in comparison to the A section. And then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. All in all, a very active chorale, but some of the big takeaways are the chromatic bass lines and what happens when you introduce chromaticism by like half-step motion, like 1, or like this D, D sharp going to E here, or this A sharp going to B here. Whenever we see these chromatic bass lines, I call them chromatic bass lines because they are just half-step motion, or there's a chromatic passing tone connecting a whole step. You typically get interesting chord progressions, and that's exactly what's happening here, this chromatic bass line here. It could be a direct modulation, but I analyzed this as a common chord modulation. This right here, interesting, where we had a 2 going to 5, but it was interrupted by another predominant chord in the form of a secondary dominant. Typically, chromatic bass lines that are longer than 3 notes give us the most interesting chord progressions, but here we have them nonetheless. And other than that, the mid-phrase modulation here, going from A minor to this very quick turnaround to G major, is very interesting. But other than that, the chorale is relatively straightforward, just dense and having to extrapolate what chords are actually happening from the texture. Sometimes it's very deliberate, like when all the voices are moving pretty much in parallel. Well, I need to be careful with the language I or I use, they're not moving in parallel. It's just all of the voices have the same type of rhythm going on, which makes analyzing them or deciding not to analyze them easier, as opposed to something like this right here where all of the voices are doing their own unique thing. And in a contrapuntal situation, it's hard to necessarily pick out individual chords that are happening, or if just one big chord is being implied with a lot of embellishing tones. But other than that, fairly straightforward, like I mentioned, and that's going to be my analysis for today. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload, and also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that more people are going to see my video, and I would love to grow the community more, invite more people to the conversation about Bach and analysis. I love that sort of thing. But other than that, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.